Welcome to the CrossCounsel podcast. We believe you have been created in God's image. However, as in all of us, the likeness of Christ has been diminished and needs to be restored by the experiential love and truth of Jesus. My name is Steve Freitag. I'm a former pastor and have been a part of CrossCounsel for over 25 years, facilitating more than 10,000 ministry sessions. In this podcast, we aim to share helpful insights and inspiring testimonies to support you on your journey. You don't need to be a spiritual giant to receive ministry with us. Just a courageous heart, open and willing to God's refining fire. Those who dive into our melt process find immediate help and lasting hope. This is Changing Generations. We've heard from many of you who have been blessed by our podcast and ministry. If you find value in what we do, we invite you to visit our website at CrossCounsel.com, and you can support us, including this podcast, with a special financial gift, or even more importantly, consider becoming a monthly supporter to sustain our ministry and keep these podcasts coming. Your support makes a lasting impact now and in generations to come, both here in the States and in many places all over the world. Hello, everybody. Today we have the return of Shane Buol. Shane was previously with us on a podcast called No Need for Weed, and it's worth your time to go back and listen to that if you haven't already. We talked about many things, including how the enemy hits us at every angle. We talked about the need to continue to weed out more lies, the beauty of people networking together on this journey to wholeness. We also discussed the impact on Shane's life as his family moved around several times and he had to make new friends and new schools. Also, if you're in the Madison area, don't forget about our fundraiser on November 9th. We have a chili cook-off and we already have 11 of the 15 spots filled. So fill the rest of those up. Hope to see you there. Hey, we're back with Shane Buol, who's appeared on our podcast before. Hey, Shane.
Hey, Steve.
What's the T-shirt about?
The T-shirt is about, this is a shirt I got on a missionary trip that I've been doing for probably the last 7-8 years down in New Orleans with an organization. One of the things they do when we go down there and work with them is they give us a T-shirt. So this one I felt was appropriate because on the back it's got Romans 12:1 and 2, which is very familiar to CrossCounsel. It's one of my favorites.
Right. So for our listeners, it's a cross that says built across and then different down. Yep. And then Shane was worried that I was going to make him face the other way for the video podcast, and then he would at least have Romans 12
That's
too
right.
in it, right?
It's in pretty tiny print though, so it'd be kind of hard to read on camera.
And I don't know if the camera reverses either,
right.
But anyway. And I thought I'd go old school with a CrossCounsel shirt from nice. 10 years ago. Nice. So yeah, I'm so glad that you're willing to come back to the podcast, and that it's kind of out of obedience, but also probably some joy that you're able to share things, right? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? I'm called to do this now.
Really the first podcast and everything leading up to that, it really just felt in line with what I felt God, kind of leading me to share my story. And, leading up to that has been just a lot of one-on-one with people and in small groups. And it was something I was praying for, and God's just continued to give me opportunities. The podcast we did was a huge blessing. There's a lot of good discussions that came out of that, and some of that we're going to talk about today, just some spin-off thoughts and stuff. But I love just being able to sit down and talk through some of this stuff. So I appreciate you having me on again.
Yeah, and I think we got more comments on the title of the podcast than we had in a while,
sure.
too. No Need for Weed.
So
this one is going to be called Weeding Out More Lies.
Yeah,
if we get to that, but there's a lot to talk about even before then. So on the podcast that we had you on before, after you answered some of the questions, you're so thoughtful and you're so articulate and you're so, what's the word for you? You write real goodly. But so you had more thoughts about how you might answer a question that I asked about what would you say to yourself X amount of years ago? Did you want to share more of what came to you with that? Yeah,
sure. And, just I guess on that, what I found in the podcast was your question when you asked me on the spot, what would my former self versus my current self say to somebody who is going through those struggles? And, it wasn't a question I had ever thought about before. So a lot of this is still pretty new to me, diving into some of these areas I have never really explored in my emotional, health and stuff. So I found that to be a really good exercise. And post podcast, I continued to think about that quite a bit, actually. And although I think I answered it true, I found there was actually a lot more there after I put some thought into it. And then I put that in an email to you, and I was just like, hey, this is, I just really wanted to get it down on, digital paper, just for really my own sake. It was just kind of putting it down and thinking through it, and it was a really good exercise. So yeah, I have that kind of right in front of me here.
Yeah, because it's important just to let people know that your present is your future past. So it's good to be thinking about things now and moving toward growing and maturing now, because if you don't, it's gonna catch up with you.
Yep.
And people say, well, you forget your past. It's like, well, your past is everything behind you. And when Paul talks about that in Philippians 3, he's not talking about just forget everything, because that's actually impossible.
Right.
So he's talking about the way that he used to think that he had to get God's approval.
Yep.
So share your thoughts. I'm looking forward to this.
Sure. So I'm just going to read this out, what I had typed out. And, again, in review, the question posed to me was, what would former Shane say to somebody struggling with, substances versus, me now? And what I had come up with some further thought of what would former Shane say? And I think I would say this probably I would have said this with a smirk on my face, maybe in a imitated Bob Marley tone. I had, hey man, we've all got wounds and scars. Nobody gets out of life alive. So sometimes you just need to take the edge off. Stay away from the stuff that can really cause you problems, like pills, hard drugs, and alcohol. Those are bad news, which I can personally relate to. Stick with the more mellow stuff like weed. Weed's not going to change you into a violent person or someone who's always saying mean and stupid stuff, as alcohol frequently does. Sure, it mellows you out quite a bit, but that's the point. Take it easy, man. Throw on some Bob Marley and just smoke a joint, and every little thing is going to be all right. And I think I kind of lived that way for a while. I grew up around some alcoholism. I saw kind of the darker side of what alcohol can do. So I remember just in high school, or it would have been late middle school, like when I first got exposed to drugs, and weed was the first one that I had exposure to. But even going back there, I had already developed a disdain for alcohol just because of my upbringing. So the pendulum swung, I think, so far the other way that I had a false perception of other drugs as safer, which I've found wasn't true either, but it was just based on what I knew at the time. So I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead, and it's going to turn out better.
Sure.
And you could argue probably some points, but in the end, I obviously decided to abstain from both, because I found different issues with weed. Sure, I didn't have some of the same problems that I've seen with alcohol, but it did bring a different bag of issues with it. So, and then, did you have anything on that, or I can read my next one?
No, I was just freaking out a little bit because I'm like, did I hit record? And I think I did. So it looks like it's going along there. So I'm pretty happy about that.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Keep that momentum going.
That's right.
Okay. So yeah, that was kind of what I thought my former self would probably have said for quite a few years. So kind of fast forward to where I'm currently at. This is a pretty well thought out response to what I think I would say to somebody now. I would say something like, take a good look at your behavior pattern as you look back at your life, how you have historically coped with negative emotions. If you've switched vices at different points in your life, like I have, try to find the common thread that ties them together. Think hard about the real reason, not the surface level answer I would have given before. Truly consider what feelings and emotions make you want to retreat, and try to understand why that is. Try to think about where these sorts of behaviors started and what made you go to them in the first place. Now you're getting closer to the root cause. Now think about those past events that perhaps you've been running from and maybe desperately trying to not let happen in your own life. And consider the possibility that maybe you're not doing as good of a job on your own avoiding them as you want to. Consider, is it possible that you've only been trying to change your behavior rather than actually trying to understand the reason you do those things in the first place? Consider the past, and then contrast with the picture of the sort of life and freedom that Scripture tells us that God has planned for us. Stop living life on autopilot and just reacting to life, and start to be intentional about how you live and the example you set for those around you. You don't have to change yourself. God will do that for you, but we first have to recognize the problem and do the work of asking God to come into our hearts. Don't be overwhelmed at the thought of how much work needs to be done. For now, just start by looking at the fork in the road that you're standing at right now and simply decide which path you truly want to take by looking back at the path you've been walking up to this point. We just need to recognize that the path we've been walking to that point has not been the easy one, and that we have the desire to walk the better path, and that the one that's not filled with the briar bushes and thorns and stuff. If we have that desire and we're willing to step out in faith to just start walking towards that new path that seems so foreign to us, God will meet us there and will direct our path as we move ahead. But we need to take the first step, and we need to move towards Him one step at a time. That's what I had written down, and I might tweak a couple things now reading that again. I think where I was at when I wrote that was just trying to put myself in that place of just being overwhelmed, with not knowing how to move forward. And, it's not to say there isn't any work. It's not like God is just going to boom, he can, right? But, my personal experience has been is that a lot of the things that I've gone through, I can see now looking back that He has used those to grow me, and that I learned just tremendous wisdom through a lot of those things. So there is work to do, but really God is the one directing the path. That's been my experience all along, is that I just had to be willing to be obedient, to say, I trust you, God, and to just watch for where He's leading me. I mean, that's kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of this. All the stuff, the work I've been doing with you guys here at CrossCounsel, and just being willing to share my story, that's all part of that journey for me, and just being willing to be obedient.
Right. Yeah, and just to be clear, too, it's not like bad things happen to us so that God would then use that in our lives.
Right.
It's, okay, we've gone off the path. We've gone down the wide path. And regardless, God can still bring about reconciliation and restoration and redemption in those things, even though that's happened to me, or even though I've done that.
Yep.
God can use those things. And one of the things that's been incredible to watch too is in people's stories where they recognize, I've been a participant in this, and I've never taken a major area in my life to God. This thing where I sinned pretty heavy. I did this thing. And I was working with this guy recently, and as he was, for the first time, even though he'd been a believer for a long time, it was the first time he took it very seriously, this sin in his life. And as we did that, it's not to punish. And I said, when we encountered Jesus in our sin, it just came to me. I said, it's not oppressive and it's not dismissive, but it's transformative.
Yeah.
When you meet Jesus in that place where you think, I know the Bible says that I can be forgiven of anything, but do I really believe that?
Right.
And when we choose to bring those things that are in the darkness out into the light, and we own whatever we need to own, and we recognize those twisted, distorted things in our hearts and how we have played a part in this, and hold that up to Jesus, it's incredible.
Yep. Yeah, and I think one of the biggest proofs of that, of the transformation, and just like, to me, like how it just shows how God takes something that, has been, like our sin, and that Satan, wants to use against us. He's going to take it, give us those lies and say, you can't be redeemed. You're too far gone. You're too damaged. But then when we're willing to be obedient to his calling and we begin to share those things, like this is what's just been just the most beautiful thing to me, is just how you see God use that obedience to encourage other people, to share the comfort that we've been given, and to comfort others. And it just like comes back full circle.
Yeah. Second Corinthians.
Wow.
Yes.
Yes,
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly. I think what the enemy can do too, it's like, you loser, you can't be forgiven of that. You're just awful. And so what we've done, or I think the enemy plays a part in this too, but humanity as well, is the dismissive side is, well, it's no big deal. Just move on. You're forgiven. But we never really take ownership of those things. And it's sort of how we've talked about somebody who has a problem with food, and they are stressed about something. They're exposed. The lie-based beliefs are right there, and they feel this emotional thing. And so the enemy whispers in their ear, well, there's those 6 pieces of pizza left over in the fridge, even though I just ate. The enemy says, yeah, that'll make you feel better. You'll numb your pain that way.
Yeah.
And then you jump into that. You make that choice. And then does the enemy say, oh, I'm glad you did what I said? Or does he say, you loser, I can't believe that you did that.
Exactly.
Right? He hits us at every side.
And that's how you get into that cycle.
Right.
Very relatable to me. And, I'll just going off recent events here. I had a camping trip just a couple weeks ago, which I had shared in, I think might have been talked a little about that in the last podcast, but it was basically a year ago. Vacations for me are kind of a weird thing I'm still working through, where, when I get out of my routine, it triggers some feelings of like instability and anxiety. And in the past, that had been a huge trigger for me to use. When I drank alcohol, there was not a vacation where I wouldn't drink pretty much the whole time. To me, that was synonymous with vacation. It was like getting blitzed or whatever. And then, I quit drinking quite a few years ago. So after that, it became other substances, weed for quite a while. And so this is since last year, when I had that really amazing session, that we talked extensively about on last podcast, I hadn't had any desire to use weed at all. But on this vacation, I found some of those old familiar feelings. I could feel myself starting to get some of those feelings of anxiety again, and that thought came back. I could tell the enemy was there feeding those old feelings, like, what will help with this? But I was like, no, just talking about that cycle that we were just talking about, the pizza. But for me, I have been through that cycle so much. That was one of there was a few things I did on vacation when I was struggling a little bit, and in the end, I was able to compose myself pretty well. It wasn't a disaster like some vacations have been, but I had to be honest that I was still struggling with some feelings there. So it revealed to me there was still more work to be done. Clearly, more work to come. But some of the strategies I used though was a lot of reflection. I thought a lot about the work I've done here at CrossCounsel, and just being involved in the community, just having a lot of accountability. That is huge for me, and that was one of the first things that God put on my heart when I started on this journey, was that I needed more accountability, because that was something I learned when I quit drinking. Was like, as an addict, if you're going to try and give something up, you can't leave yourself like a loophole to get back into it. Because if you don't tell anybody you're quitting, nobody's going to be disappointed in you. If you go back to it, nobody will even know. So it's real easy to quit, tell one person, and then be like, had a bad week, I'm drinking again, but this only one person knows. Right. They don't care that much. So I'm way more invested now. I've really put myself out there, and it really made a difference to me, because I would think about those things and be like, no, you got to think about all those conversations. Like, what if I chose to do that? I would have to explain that, and no, I'm not going to do that. I also just spent time in Scripture. There was actually a couple pretty significant verses that God gave me at just the right time. I got them saved on my phone, but I don't have them in front of me. But there was just, so putting myself in His Word, being able to receive, from Him if He had anything to teach me, and He did. So those are a couple of the things I did, and then just reflecting back on that cycle. That was a big one for me, because I had done that pattern for so many times that I was able to, in my mind, see exactly how, I go through the options. Well, I could probably drive 10 miles and I could find something at a store, I could do that.
Right.
But I have done that, and I know how it always ends up.
Or when you're camping, you might just walk 10 feet.
That's true.
And you might find
Just
some next
follow
door.
the smell.
That's right.
But I have done that before, and it's like the pizza, right? It's like, if I do that, I know what's going to happen at the end. The enemy's going to be there, and I'm going to be in the middle of that. I'm going to be feeling the guilt, the shame. So, and all that just helped me to remember why I've been doing the work I've been doing, but so yeah, but it was a little bit of an experience, that just revealed some things in myself that were still there. So
right, which means we're not done.
Correct.
It's great when there's certain areas where, wow, I never have to struggle with that again. But this is an annual thing.
Yep.
Right. And you camp at least once a year. Right. And so it would be very easy and it would be very natural to think, okay, well, I'm never camping again.
Right.
And as understandable as that is, I say, no, keep that going, because it'll be one of the markers in your progress.
Exactly.
And so I know that you'll be faithful to taking a look at what was still left over from this camping trip. That was a disaster not that long ago, and now it was more of an inner disaster, but you were in such a place that you didn't ruin anybody else's camping trip.
Correct.
Right? And which is so valuable.
Yeah, no, I had talked to my wife about it when I got back, because part of me just wanted to know if, did she see anything going on with me? Because when I've been in like a bit of a funk at times, and I didn't really feel like I was in a funk, but sometimes I'm not the best. I can't take my own temperature, like I'm not, I don't know how I look on the outside. So when we had gotten home, I told her, like, hey, I just wanted you to know I had struggled with some of the, these repeat feelings I've had before. And she didn't really know that. So she said, well, you did pretty good.
Right.
She was disappointed though, and for her own reasons, it was a bit of I think it was a little stressful for her to hear, because she wants me to have the same joy that she gets out of vacation.
Right.
And I was like, well, but that's what I want too. Like, that's why I don't want to bail on camping. I'm not going to just give up. Like, I just see a problem that we got to figure out. So what?
Because there's a greater good. It's
Exactly.
the time with family, and that goes quicker than you think.
And like you just said, it wasn't a total disaster. Like, I could only go back a couple years and it was totally different. Like, just very palpable anxiety that the entire group around me could feel. And I just felt like I was bringing everybody down. I didn't have that this time. So. And
this is what you also have to throw in the mix, that now you know how much better it can be. You know what the Lord has done in your heart and some of the peace that you've experienced in other areas. And so that your bar is higher.
Yeah.
And I live with that all
true.
the time. I'm like, oh my gosh, I recognize my anger. I recognize when I'm not at peace far more than I ever did, because I was just oblivious to it. I was willingly oblivious.
Yep.
And now that's gone in you.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
So welcome to that world.
Yeah, it's good.
And it's not to get into the just being so self-absorbed. It's just being aware. And I love that it didn't ruin the trip.
Yep.
And that this is just one more marker for me. It's one more way to test the parameters, test the tolerances in my life, and say, Lord, okay, I'm going to continue to put myself out there. I'm going to continue to take those kind of risks. And I know that you're faithful to help me recognize now what needs to be addressed in that, how you want to refine my faith, those places I need to go where you can untangle those twisted, distorted lies in your heart. It's so cool.
100%.
So you've gotten feedback from other people in our community, and they've reached out to you to get your perspective on things. Is there anything about that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I mean, just got a lot of encouragement. But yeah, there's somebody who reached out with a lot of encouragement and thanking me for, being willing to come on the podcast. And we actually had some dialogue back and forth that was another really good exercise. She had asked some questions that were thought-provoking for me. And, one of those things that got me thinking was just trying to reflect on what are the different reasons that, a person chooses to use a substance. And you could expand that. It doesn't have to be substances. It could be the eating pizza really is about escapism, But so I was thinking about it, in relation to myself, because it's a good question. Why would I? Because it becomes so instinctual. It's not like when I would use something, I was thinking it's like, I'm going to do this to numb out. I mean, maybe sometimes, because it's a bad day. I'm going to drown myself in a 6-pack or smoke this joint. I mean, sometimes it is that obvious, but sometimes it isn't. So a couple of the common things I came up with for myself was, the obvious one is, running from negative emotions. And another one, I think, which to me was how I got started with drugs. Actually, looking back, it was probably my 8th or 9th grade year of middle school. I was hanging out with people who were using drugs, and I had a lot of, I think, acceptance issues because as a kid, my parents divorced when I was fairly young, and we had moved around several times, so I really didn't have any roots. I didn't have any lifelong friends that I had just grown up with, and so that was, I think, one of the symptoms of that. When you bounce around a lot, you want to feel like you have a group, and I definitely experienced that, and I think that just played out in my life for a long time. The people that I would end up calling my friends, I just, rather than standing on what my beliefs were, I would just get sucked up in whatever they were doing, because I didn't want to react in a way that would get me ostracized, or kicked out of the group, and then I'm left without friends, Right. So I think there's something to be said for that, and that definitely manifested in other ways in my life too. But I think that wasn't just the first time. That continued too. There were definitely times where maybe I didn't want to use something, but because the people around me were doing it, it was easier to just go with the flow than to just say, no, I'm trying to work on my mental health or whatever, And then the thing about that is it makes it really hard to pull out of that, because there might have been periods where I was thinking that maybe I should make changes, but when you make a bad decision and you plunge back in, you're just caught back up in that cycle again, and it's so hard to pull yourself out of it. And then the longer you do it, it's just hard to see any other way of life, because it's just all you know.
And we keep that all a secret too. And so many of us are going through that, and we keep it a secret.
And that was a big thing for me, because especially being a Christian, I think made it, even worse, because obviously I knew these things I was doing weren't acceptable in the church, and even to people just close to me. My wife, actually, I mean, I had some problems with lying to keep things covered up for a long time, just because I knew if I was completely honest that she wasn't going to be okay with that. Well, that means I either have to change my behavior or I have to cover it up. And I chose to cover it up a lot. So there's a lot of extra weight that goes along with that too, that you don't really think about. But yeah, the lying, it's heavy to carry around.
Right.
Digging deeper into the negative emotions, one of the things that I've learned about myself as I've gotten off of weed, especially, because I think, unlike alcohol, alcohol for me was actually a lot easier to quit, because it was a lot easier to see the dark side of it for me, because it was the longer I did it, and looking back now, it was probably all these emotional things that I had. That alcohol, I feel like, just allows those to come out so much easier. So family members had commented on, that I was negative or mean. And I could see it myself. There's some things that I said that just weren't nice, things I had to go back and apologize for. So that one was a lot easier to quit. I mean, it was still hard, but it was easier than weed. Weed, though, I felt, although it didn't have those obvious destructive behaviors, one of the worst things about it was its numbing effects, which is why I went to it in the first place.
Right.
But what I found is that besides numbing the bad things, it also numbed the good things. So I definitely, looking back, I can see that the years that I was heavily doing that regularly, like, I just wasn't feeling as much in general, so you're not feeling the negative stuff, but you're not feeling as much joy. I think I noticed some of my passions, hobbies and stuff kind of also got tapered off. Okay. I mean, and I've known so many people that were really big into smoking weed, and I think you just see it after a while, if you're not consumed by it anyways, that it just kind of becomes your life. You get obsessed with it. But for me, after I kind of stopped doing that, and I really feel like that was just something that God was showing me, even while I was still struggling to come off of it, but he was showing me how sensitive of an emotional disposition I have. And I stumbled across a letter. It was not a letter, it was a writing exercise from probably when I was in first or second grade that I got from my mom in a box of pictures that she had given me, that she cleaning out the closet or something like that. And it really connected the dots for me, just to realize that I am just a super sensitive person, and I always have been. I struggled with death when I was a kid. I think just through learned things I picked up in my environment. I didn't really have a good way to cope with those. When you feel a lot, it's what do you do with that? And I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the ability to take those feelings and channel them into something good, which is what I'm learning how to do now. And that ties into what we were talking about at the beginning, seeing how God uses that to comfort other people. I mean, to me, that's filling in those gaps that I didn't, that were present when I was younger. But I just was going to read this letter real quick.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So this writing exercise, it was in one of these like bound books, and had the dashed lines, and it basically had all these different emotional exercises. I feel happy when, I feel mad when, and one of them was I feel sad when. And that part was filled in, and I wrote the rest. So what I wrote was, I feel sad when I think of my Uncle Chris and my great-grandpa who are dead. It is really sad. My mom cries, and so do I, especially when we see their grave. It is very, very sad. I hate it when people die. I am also sad when I watch sad movies. So it was a couple years ago I got this from my mom. It was when I was, I think, starting to get into counseling again. And it really hit me hard, because it just confirmed that this is who I am. I have a sensitive nature. That's not bad. Like, God made me who I am. I don't have to feel bad about that. But what I need to figure out is, okay, it's obvious that I just feel emotions. Like, I've always been a very is it empathic or empathetic? I don't know what the word is, but I feel the sadness of the people around me. I've just always been there. And when it's funny that I wrote that about movies too. I am also sad when I watch sad movies. My wife will be the first to tell you that I cry more than she does when we watch, emotional movies and stuff. So I'm at a place now where, instead of trying to get rid of that and be like, I hate that part of myself because it's too much of a burden, I'm enjoying seeing how God actually wants to use that to do other things that point people to him. But that Yeah, I can't think of a better way to describe it when you can't make that connection, when you can't see how God wants to use that. Instead of feeling like a gift, it feels like a curse.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that for a long time.
I can relate to that. And I think my perspective on that is there might be a bent toward things. Scripture talks about raise up a child according to his or her bent. So there might be a bent that way, but it can also be accelerated or exacerbated because of how we've interpreted life as well. I was a sensitive kid, but the more that I started to dismantle this stuff with Jesus, the more that I realized how much other stuff was attached to it. So with sadness, when there's death, there should be sadness. That's part of the human experience. But there can also be this sense of this person who was close to me died, and I'm removing you from this now. And this, as a child, this person died. Well, nobody talked me through this. Nobody walked me through this. Nobody came alongside, or they were very dismissive because, wow, I was only 7 years old. They probably didn't think that I even was processing anything. The kids are fine. Oh my goodness. Right. That's not a great thing. That's not a great perspective when you're really naive to what's really happening. So on top of the truth-based sadness, there can be a sense of helplessness. There can be a sense of failure. You can see somebody close to you, even an adult, who's crying, struggling, mourning, grieving. And there's this little boy heart or there's this little girl heart that says, I should fix that. But I can't. I don't even have the words to say it. And I'm sort of even shut out from this. And so there's so many different areas that the enemy can take a hold of that, or in our own flesh, we just are trying to make sense of something that doesn't seem to make sense to us when we haven't been able to process it from a perspective of truth. So I think it is even with the bent that we have, the more that we identify and weed out the lies that might be attached to the truth-based pain, the more pure it is.
Yes, that is really good.
Yeah. That's probably a pretty good place to wrap up for today.
Yeah.
All right. I appreciate you coming back on, and we'll see you again. Thanks for joining us on the CrossCounsel podcast. Keep pursuing transformation with a courageous heart, open to what only He can do. There are many ways to get involved. Pray for us, consider supporting us, share these podcasts, and if you haven't already, take the step to jump in yourself. We'll see you next time.